What we have witnessed this week, though largely ignored in the tumult of headlines, may be one of the darkest moral turns in recent Conservative politics. A proposal, not a speech at a fringe meeting, not an idle tweet, but a draft parliamentary bill that would allow the deportation of people who came to Britain legally, worked, paid taxes, and in many cases raised British children, if their earnings fell below £38,700 for 6 months, or if they ever received state support, child benefit, maternity pay, or help during COVID, they could be stripped of their indefinite leave to remain and expelled. The sponsor of this obscenity is Chris Philp, but its public face is the new Tory rising star Katie Lamb. Lamb is, in a now notorious interview, claimed that once these people were expelled, Britain would be left with what she called a mostly but not entirely culturally coherent group of people. That phrase, culturally coherent, chills the blood. It's a euphemism for ethnic sorting. It's an attempt to launder the language of racial purity through the diction of policy think tanks and Home Office spreadsheets. Ian Dunk called it one of the most extreme anti-immigration policies ever proposed by a democratic state, worse in scope than Trump's ICE operations and more radical in intent than Idi Amin's Ugandan expulsions. That is not hyperbole. This plan would require mass roundups by lawful residents. It would split families, deport nurses, expel pensioners, and tear British children from their parents. It would criminalise poverty and maternity. It would, in effect, turn Britain into a deportation state. And yet, what is more disturbing still is not the proposal itself, but the silence that greets it. There has been no great Conservative rebellion, no front bench apology, no moral recoil. Lamb's remarks have been raised with the whips as if this were an administrative misstep rather than an ethical collapse. Kemi Badenoch's office has said the comments are broadly in line with party policy, an astonishing phrase that should haunt the party's conscience from now through to its demise. The nastiness is not an accident, it's a strategy. Each new Tory generation must outbid, it seems, the last in cruelty to prove its purity. Robert Jenrick turned deportation into virtue. Lamb turns it into theatre. The language is softly spoken, the voice educated and calm, the delivery almost compassionate, but the moral content is brutal. She represents what one commentator called the pantsuit deporters, this new breed of respectable authoritarians who dress barbarity in technocratic tones. And there's irony that Lamb herself is a descendant of Jewish refugees saved by Britain from Nazi Germany. Her grandmother arrived here in 1937 as a 13-year-old girl escaping fascism. Her great-great-grandfather, Paul Haide, was a social democrat who fled imprisonment under Hitler. Without the compassion of this country, she would not exist. Now she calls for policies that echo the very rhetoric that once sought to keep her ancestors out. We've heard this music before. In the 1930s, the Daily Mail warned that Jewish refugees were pouring into the country. G.K. Chesterton wrote that Jews could never truly belong in England. It's a monstrous perversion of the principle that that Britain welcomes the refugee, that Britain has a principle that is good. But this is not about tightening the border or a new framework for future applicants. It's the deliberate retrospective removal of rights from people who followed every rule, paid every tax, built their lives in good faith. This is against the very principles that are enshrined in the work of people like Bentham, that you cannot produce retrospective laws. This is a grotesque proposal, and it needs to be called out. The Conservative Party has been on this downward moral trajectory for years, from Theresa May's hostile environment to Suella Braverman's fantasies of deportation flights to Rwanda. I dream of Rwanda. To Robert Jenrick's cynical race-baiting over cultural incompatibility and tearing down posters. Katie Lamb is simply the latest and most explicit expression of a mindset that prizes exclusion as a virtue and decency as a weakness. Even within her own party, colleagues are horrified. Tory MPs have complained to the whips. Some have quietly asked what on earth culturally coherent actually means. But the leadership is paralysed. Kemi Badenoch's office calls Lamb's words broadly in line with party policy, James cleverly claims not to have read the bill. Chris Philp, who wrote it, insists it's all perfectly legal, and the slide continues. Lam's defenders compare her to Denmark's Frederiksen, one of the supposed new generation of pantsuit deporters, women who deliver hard-right policies in calm technocratic tones. But there's nothing moderate about bureaucratized brutality. Dressing it in a trouser suit doesn't make it more humane. The fact that it's promoted by a woman doesn't give it some sort of imprimatur of common sense. The most tragic irony is the fact that her paternal relatives died in Sobibor and Auschwitz. Britain offered sanctuary to her family when tyranny had taken everything else, and yet now their descendants, advocates policies that would have denied them entry or sent them back. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And the echo here is unmistakable. When politicians start speaking of cultural coherence or restoring national purity, of deporting people who don't quite fit in, we should hear alarm bells from the darkest chapters of the 20th century. And even now, too many pretend not to notice. We shouldn't talk about the 1930s. Labour's official response was limp, almost embarrassed. The Lib Dems did better, but it fell to commentators like Sundar Katwala and Rob Ford to spell out what this means, that Britain risks aligning itself morally with the ugliest episodes of post-colonial expulsion. And that is the real scandal. Not just the nastiness of the Conservative proposal, but the moral timidity of those who refuse to denounce it outright. The British public, when honestly informed, are not as cruel as their politicians. Polling shows that when voters understand the trade-offs, the effect of the NHS on families, on our international reputation, support for mass deportation collapses. People want fairness, not fascism. They want rules, not revenge. If this is the Conservative Party now, I want nothing to do with it. I traded in my Conservative membership a few years ago. And I'm rather sorry about that, because this would be the point at which I would say enough is enough. But I've been talking for a good 2 years about the threat to the Conservative Party from outside, from reform. And the stupidity of the Conservative parties lurch to the right in order to survive. If this is where it's going, it shouldn't survive. This must be a line in the sand. We cannot allow retrospective punishment to become a tool of government. We cannot permit Britain, a nation that prided itself on the rule of law and sanctuary, to become a cold, frightened island that turns on its own citizens. The nastiness is not an accident, it's now the brand. But history teaches us that those that build their politics on cruelty eventually choke on it. And perhaps in time, the Conservatives will find that a politics of exclusion leaves them with a very small, very bitter, very lonely, culturally coherent party, indeed, that will never see office again. And it doesn't matter whether Katie Lamb or Robert Jenrick lead that party. They're leading it into the desert and into obscurity and ultimately into non-existence. This is not the sort of proposal that makes a party the nasty party. It's a sort of proposal that kills the party.